how does being in Europe or being outside of Europe have any consequence to the nature of monetary, fiscal responsibility on any part of the individual? Or how much does it more have bearing on the charity which befits a Europe which has at its heart its social evolution? Well, when they go back to the reunification in the Habsburg empires before the might of the two Schleswig War, to the days of Maria Theresa and the Empress of Austria under Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, you can check and you can find out how much being in any confederation or any union by any nation, European or otherwise, is affected by the effect of confederacy. We take, for instance, the Confederation of the Rhine. That was a confederation of client states. The Third French Empire formed initially from 16 German states by Napoleon after he defeated Austria and Russia in the Battle of Alpine. So, you fight Napoleon because not so kosher as to effect a free France, and what any more exhibits the fear of invasion than the might of as many Confederate armies by the Emperor himself. If you study much from the histories of the Georges, the English throne, George I, 1717, 27, 18, 17, 16, and 1820. You look and study the histories of the Emperor and the effect after the Battle of Austerlitz, as the Treaty of Pressburg in effect led to the creation of the Federation of the Rhine. It lasted from 1806 to 13, it's quite a long time. How many more? How many times are confederacies united in their attempt to make free the peoples which its emperors represent, or its free statesmen declare in all humility of democracy? Or how much control is in control itself? One may go back to Maria Theresa of Austria, Empress. One may go back to the Holy Roman Empire, which George is king, 1717, 27, 2, and King George III, 1760, all wished to eradicate in favour of a church for England. Yet how many were able to facilitate that there was even going to be such peace within its own land that made that the Confederation of the Rhine, formed initially from 16 German states by Napoleon after he defeated Russia and Austria's Battle of Austerlitz, Treaty of Pressburg. In fact, it led to the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. It lasted from 1806 to 13, quite a long time. But how much more did the imposition of having a general on the seat of Prime Minister of England in 1830 in the form of Wellington have any effect in ceasing to allow the sovereignty of emperoric treaties to annihilate its enemies or to assuage its greater greatness? One may need only study the will and effort of Bonaparte. If you study from Wellington, from Wellington, first Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, KG, GCB, GCHBC, FRS, an Anglo-Irish soldier, statesman, one of the leading military and political figures of the 19th century. How much was his affair that was succeeding to Parliament as Prime Minister, that was preceded by Viscount Melbourne, quite an efficient Prime Minister. That here's a facility that the succeeding after Wellington by Earl Grey in what year? 1834? 1830. Was in any way going to prevent necessary reform of Parliament? And what culminated in the kind of reform which would mean anything was any less desired or regretful or more regretful by the defeat of Napoleon in the year 1815 by Waterloo than the affairs of the Reform Act of 1832 of Parliament, England, was going to ever achieve. Bearing in mind particularly its failing in the 17th century with the wars with France and some 200 years before the 100 Years' War with France. One need only equate the problems that any historical background has of peace treaties, the wars between wars and countries and nations, all part of becoming one, or is it all part of remaining separate? What has facilitated consumerism to the degree that you benefit from, for instance, having a cordless vacuum when you are not provided with sufficient information as to when its charge will run out? We take, for instance, the war of 1870-71 between France and Germany, which kicked up last. The hostilities began after France had declared war on Prussia on the 19th of July 1870. 2 months later, and all German military force had already defeated the main French army. I mean, there was a foreign intervention in these things of any European or confederation of opinion which would either stop Germany in those 2 months defining a definitive treaty of peace opened in Brussels, where the negotiations dragged on for a while without making any significant headway. The final peace was signed the 10th of May 1871, and the exchange of instruments of ratification took place on the 20th of May 1871. What help was this going to be in the long term to prevent, for instance, World War I and II? And the answer you clearly have. What help was this going to be in the long term to prevent, for instance, World War I and II? And the answer you clearly have. You do not need a historian to tell you. So it should be recalled that the French-German War of 1870-71 was a bilateral war, with no other European powers intervened. And this fact you are led to believe or told, but do you believe it? This fact certainly facilitated the conclusion of a peace treaty. It also contributed to the relatively modest dimensions of the two instruments, the preliminary peace treaty, consisting of 10 articles, while the Frankfurt Peace Treaty encompassed 17 articles. The conditions impressed on France were simple and straightforward. But viewer, they were not so simple and straightforward as to prevent the outrage of 1914. Statement by the poor, by the gun, of the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, or in fact was the empire itself acceding to a democratic freedom that would last, imposed by its own rapport for centuries beyond its own credibility to come, despite the waning Mozart and Maria Theresa. Well, you would have to study music in part to find out what is the difference between nationalism and socialism. And if you played the same theme with the theme of socialism, how much would it be as appealing as the theme so aspiring to nationalism? Well, you may only need to look at such people as Shostakovich, as George Gershwin, or as the beauty Claude. Good afternoon. Curiously, for some, those who have asked questions of their sellers, and I am not any exception, have asked about the piano but not asked what the effects of the piano per se has been on the entity which is that known or called Europe. But what is nationalism? The piano, but not asked what the effects of the piano per se has been on the entity which is that known or called Europe. But what is nationalism in art? Nationalism in art is about the definition of populace, wherever it may be. Populace is about people. Then what is about art that makes more music tangible to the equivocations of fascination? I tell you what it is. Some people have told me that they value the music of, for instance, Mussorgsky. Mussorgsky, one of these very nationalist composers, was to some extent unequivocally personified by the nature as far away from empire, or as far away from what some may call European, as it could become, that you may wonder how many pictures in an exhibition constitute greatness, be it their connections with the French, the connections with the Dutch. For what is art outside of national interests? The pathos that lends the degrees of brilliance to the technique of making sound become equations, don't they, for codes which denote by the way the music is played or the way the music is honed by a particular instrument to be more, for instance, of one country or another. That, for instance, if you were playing one film theme on the balalaika, it would, for instance, emanate more from Russian enterprise than of anything of the British person who was playing it. But unshaken by some people who prefer to differ, who prefer to say, does Europe in its oneness give to the individual any more than it does take away from the integrity of the isolate? The isolate, the person who would be unanimously one exempt from the vote, one exempt from playing Debussy in the style of perhaps any style. Or is it more permissible under, for instance, the Nazis to play Bach more in the style of its choir than of its international keyboard? For there are two things up there essential in the recognition of art to be attracted to any one person or people. are two degrees by which art can achieve its fame. One is in its identity of code, and two is in the ability of people, who they call them prime ministers, who they call them dictators, who they call them presidents, that would regulate the way that, for instance, the loves of the great Führer Adolf Hitler, Wagner, should be performed at the expense of some jazz, which did not represent the kind of cultures of ethnicity which was becoming of the true German citizen. And how much you value truth is no longer questioned, but by as much you subjugate your reaction to your controller and your emperor. So how much is the piano influenced by whether you are a member of Europe or whether you are of the Debussy mob? The difference, my friends, is not in the way you play it, is not in who you subjugate yourself to, and it is not in, strangely, is it, what you believe or say you believe. The entity of great art, that is a code which cannot be imitated, is more the genius of the isolate, the person they removed, the person who would not fit in to the Nazi regime, who did not appreciate Wagner as much as George Gershwin, or who did not appreciate what appreciations are led to any history of national identity above that which is pure art, however fragile, however isolated, however broken be such an individual by any political aim or revolution that would, on some balalaika or some piano, never be able again to play in the same way. Dr. Zhivago, I leave these thoughts with you, that when you decide whether you will vote in or whether you will vote out, ask yourself why you considered to even listen to those who told you you would be voting in the first place. And who are they who told you you would be voting in the first place? Are they the people who are able to define Debussy's Clair de Lune? Or are they the people who will tell you the moon belongs to them and leave you desolate, unable to find anyone who has even heard of Claude Debussy? Mein prime. It is not for its human, which I would ever give up the idea of individualism, not for the ethos of politician, emperor, dictator, or nationalism. It is purely me. Thank you.